No girl with flour on her sleeves is worth a man crossing the street every morning, Cecilia Holt said, loud enough for the bakery line to hear. Dolly Parker kept both hands on the cooling board and lifted the rye loaves one by one, letting the heat sting her palms because it gave her something steady to hold. The men near the door looked at the bread instead of her. The women pretended to study the seed cakes. Outside, the January wind moved dust along the boardwalk, and inside the rented back room of Briggs Bakery, Dolly's name disappeared the way it usually did, under orders, coins, and other people's hunger. She had worked there 6 years. She came before sunrise, when the stove bricks still held a little of yesterday's warmth, and she left after the last pan was scrubbed and set on its side to dry. She mixed dough by lamplight, fed the starter like it was something living, carried flour sacks half her size from the storeroom, and shaped each loaf with the same care whether it was going to a banker's table or a miner's tin plate. Most folks knew the bread. Few knew the woman. They called her the bakery girl, though she was 29 and no longer felt like any kind of girl when her shoulders ached by noon. She slept in a narrow rented room over the harness shop, where the window rattled when the freight wagons passed, and the walls smelled faintly of leather and rain. On a shelf beside her wash basin sat a folded paper she had carried for 3 years, a notice for an empty storefront at the far end of Main Street, 2 windows wide, with a brick oven gone cold in the back. She had traced the words so often the ink had softened at the edges. A bakery of her own had once seemed like a thing a person could walk toward if she kept her head down and worked. Lately it felt more like a lantern seen across a river after the bridge had washed out. That morning, Mr. Briggs came in with his vest buttoned wrong and his temper already sour. He counted the coins from the till twice, then told Dolly flour prices had risen again and her pay would have to wait another week. She nodded once. She did not ask what she was supposed to eat until then. Asking made a person smaller when the answer was already lying on the counter. At 7:30, Tobias James stepped through the door. The room did what rooms often did when he entered. It quieted, not from fear, but from the weight of a man who did not waste movement. He was 37, broad through the shoulders, his coat brushed clean but worn at the cuffs, his boots carrying pale dust from the North Road. He took off his hat before he looked at the counter. Not at Cecilia. Not at the line. At the bread. Dolly set the rye loaf forward without thinking, the best one, split clean along the top where the steam had opened it. Tobias placed his coin down flat, then another beside it. Not too much to shame her. Just enough to cover what Mr. Briggs had cut, without saying he knew. Dolly saw it. So did no one else who mattered. Tobias picked up the loaf, gave a small nod, and left the room with the bread tucked under one arm, as if it were worth carrying carefully. Cecilia laughed under her breath after the door closed. Dolly reached for the next loaf. Her hands were still warm. For the first time that morning, they did not shake. The second coin stayed in Dolly's mind longer than it should have. She found herself looking for it each time she wiped the counter, though Mr. Briggs had already swept it into the till with the rest. Tobias did not mention it the next morning. He came at the same hour, hat in hand, shoulders carrying the cold from the North Road, and waited his turn behind 2 freight men and Mrs. Holt's younger sister, who kept glancing back as if his silence were something she might change by noticing it hard enough. Dolly set out the rye loaf when he reached the counter. He placed down the proper coin this time. Exact. No charity. Then he paused, looked at the edge of the board where one corner had split and begun to snag the cloth, and turned his hand over once, as if measuring the repair in his head. He left with the bread. By noon, when Dolly came back from carrying ash to the alley, the board had been planed smooth. No note, no speech, just the scrape marks cleaned away and the cloth lying flat for the first time in weeks. Mr. Briggs said one of the carpenters must have done it. Dolly said nothing. The next day, Tobias bought rye again. The day after that, the same. By the end of the week, Dolly had begun setting the loaf near the front, not because she was waiting for him, but because good bread ought to be easy to reach for a man who handled it carefully. On Friday, snow came thin and sideways before dawn. The back step iced over, and Dolly nearly lost a pan of rolls bringing it in from the cooling shelf. She steadied herself against the doorframe and found fresh sand spread over the step when she went out again an hour later. Across the street, Tobias was tightening the girth on his horse, his gloves dark with wet grit. He did not look over. That made it easier to accept. Work changed a thing before words did. By the second week, she knew the sound of his boots on the floorboards. She knew he chose the loaf with the darkest crust when she had made several. She knew he never touched bread with careless fingers. One morning, Mary Wilkes brought in her 2 little boys, both red-cheeked and hungry from the cold, and counted pennies twice before choosing the smallest loaf. Dolly wrapped the larger one instead. Mary started to protest. Dolly only tied the string tighter. When she looked up, Tobias had seen. He bought 2 loaves that morning and left one on the sill outside, where Mary would pass on her way home. The town kept talking. Dolly kept baking. And every morning, the same man came back, buying bread as if returning was the most ordinary promise in the world. On the 3rd Monday of January, Dolly found a flour sack waiting beside the back door with her name written on the tag in a hand she did not know. Not the bakery's name. Hers. She stood in the alley with the cold biting through her shawl, looking at those 5 letters as if they had been set there to test whether she would claim them. Mr. Briggs came out behind her, saw the sack, and reached for it. Dolly put one hand on the twine before he touched it. He looked at her. She looked back. The sack stayed where it was. After a moment, he muttered that she could use it for the morning batch since charity flour baked the same as any other. Dolly carried it inside herself. 50 pounds. Heavy enough to make her arms burn. Real enough to make silence difficult. The flour was finer than what Briggs usually bought. Soft between her fingers, clean and pale, in the wooden bin. She used part of it for the rye, part for 2 pans of dinner rolls, and saved a small measure in a folded cloth beneath the work table because waste had no place in a life like hers. Tobias came in after sunrise, later than usual, with frost on his coat and a small tear in one glove. Dolly noticed because he had noticed the board, the step, the boys, and noticing had become a quiet thing passed between them. She set out the rye. He set down the coin. His eyes moved once to the flour dust on her sleeve, brighter than usual. He did not smile. He did not ask. But when he lifted the loaf, he turned it in his hands the way a man might turn over a piece of good joinery. Careful. Respectful. Mrs. Holt was near the window, pretending not to watch. Tobias placed a second coin on the counter and pointed to the dinner rolls cooling behind Dolly. She wrapped 4. He carried them across the street to old Mr. Keene, who had been sitting outside the mercantile with his collar turned up and no fire waiting at home but what he could coax from damp wood. Dolly saw the exchange through the bakery glass. Tobias did not make a show of it. Mr. Keene took the rolls with both hands. That was the whole of it. By noon, 3 people asked who had made the rolls, not where they had been bought. Dolly answered plainly. That evening, when she went upstairs over the harness shop, she took out the old storefront notice and smoothed it on her table. 2 windows wide. Brick oven in the back. She did not let herself dream long. She folded the paper, washed the flour from her hands, and set the starter near the stove for morning. But before she blew out the lamp, she looked once at her own name on the tag from the flour. Sack, saved and tucked beside the notice, and left both where she could see them. The notice on Dolly's table changed the shape of her mornings. She did not speak of it, but she began measuring the day against it. A little less sugar wasted on the counter. A little more care with the firewood so the oven held steady. The small measure of fine flour beneath the work table became something she guarded without making a ceremony of guarding it. Tobias kept coming. Exact coin. Same hour when the roads allowed it. Same careful hands around the loaf. Once, when the wind drove sleet under the bakery door and made the floorboards slick, he stepped aside before leaving and wedged a strip of scrap leather beneath the gap. He had likely cut it from an old harness. He pressed it once with his boot, saw that it held, and went out into the cold with his bread. Dolly watched the bottom of the door stop trembling. That was how he was. He saw a place where weather got in, and he closed it. On Wednesday, Mr. Briggs sent Dolly to the empty storefront at the far end of Main Street to fetch 2 iron pans he had lent the former tenant years before and forgotten until he wanted something to complain about. The key stuck in the lock. The room opened with the smell of dust, cold brick, and old ash. 2 front windows faced the street. Narrow but bright. In the back, the brick oven sat dark, its mouth blackened and its stones chipped along one side. Dolly stood in front of it with the pans against her skirt and did not move for a long while. She saw where shelves could go. She saw a counter by the windows. She saw morning light across loaves cooling on clean boards. Then she saw the cracked plaster, the missing stovepipe, the rent notice nailed crooked by the door, and she picked up the pans. Work first, wanting later. Tobias was outside when she came out, tightening a loose wagon trace for Mrs. Wilkes while her boys watched from the seat. He looked at the pans in Dolly's arms, then at the storefront behind her. Not much, only enough to see more than she meant to show. She lowered her eyes and started back toward Briggs' bakery. He finished the trace. Before he crossed the street, he did not ask if she wanted the place. That would have been too large a question for a cold afternoon and a woman carrying someone else's pans. Instead, he took the heavier one from the top of her stack and walked beside her until they reached the bakery door. She let him carry it because her fingers were stiff and because he did not make her thank him before doing what was useful. The next morning, Dolly found a clean sheet of brown wrapping paper on the counter before sunrise. On it, someone had drawn the empty storefront from memory. 2 windows, a counter, shelves, the brick oven marked carefully in the back. Beside the oven was one small note in plain pencil. Needs new flue before spring. Dolly stood with flour on her hands and the starter breathing softly in its crock. Outside, Tobias's horse was already tied across the street, steam lifting from its back in the blue morning cold. He had seen the dream she had never spoken aloud, and he had treated it like a thing that could be repaired. By the end of January, the drawing of the storefront had become part of the bakery's morning work. Dolly kept it folded beneath the flour ledger, not hidden exactly, but close enough that she could reach it when the room was still dark and the world had not yet begun asking for bread. She studied it while the first batch rose. She measured the counter in steps inside her head. She counted shelves by the number of loaves a family might need in a week. Then she washed her hands and went back to Briggs's dough because dreaming did not fill a till and flour did not pay for itself. Tobias kept his place in the rhythm. On Monday, he brought back the cloth she had used to wrap his loaf the week before, washed clean and folded square. On Tuesday, he bought his rye and left a small twist of stove blacking beside the back door, the kind used to seal thin cracks around iron. Dolly found it after smoke had been leaking from the side seam all morning. On Thursday, when Mr. Briggs complained that the delivery boy had not come and the woodpile was low, Tobias split enough cordwood behind the bakery to carry the oven. Through 2 days, he did it before sunrise. Dolly knew because the axe marks were fresh and straight, and because he came in later with sawdust on his sleeve and said nothing of it. She did not thank him in front of the others. He would not have liked that. Instead, she wrapped the darkest rye loaf in the clean cloth and tucked 2 small rolls beside it, still warm from the back pan. His hand paused when he felt the weight. Then he lifted the bundle and nodded once. That was enough. The kindnesses did not make her careless. They made her steadier. She rose earlier. She saved every heel of bread that could be dried for crumbs. She taught Mary Wilkes how to stretch yesterday's loaf with milk and eggs so her boys could have a hot supper. She showed old Mr. Keene how to warm rolls in a covered skillet without burning the bottoms. When a ranch hand from Tobias's spread came in with a torn flour sack and no idea how to mend it before the grain spilled, Dolly threaded a needle with heavy twine and fixed the seam across the counter while customers waited. The man tried to pay extra. She shook her head and sent him away with the sack sound and a heel of brown bread wrapped in paper. 2 days later, 3 James ranch hands came in before dawn and bought breakfast rolls for the road. They took off their hats when they stepped inside. Not because anyone told them to, because Tobias had. By then the children had started watching for Dolly through the bakery window. Mary's boys pressed mittened hands to the glass when the sweet buns came out. A little girl from the dressmaker's shop brought back a clean basket every Wednesday, careful as church. Dolly began setting aside imperfect loaves for families who came late with short coins. She did it quietly. Tobias saw it anyway. He saw most things. Near the 1st of February, he came in carrying a narrow wooden shelf under one arm. Smooth pine. Pegs fitted tight. He waited until the morning rush had thinned, then set it near the wall where Dolly always ran out of space. Mr. Briggs objected until Tobias took out 2 nails, hung the shelf level, and placed his own paid loaf on it, as if the matter had already been settled by usefulness. The room changed at once. Small things had room to belong. Wrapped rolls, cooling biscuits, a jar of saved pennies for the church widow's coal. Dolly stood behind the counter with flour on her apron and looked at the shelf longer than a shelf deserved. That evening, after she scrubbed the pans and banked the fire, She took the storefront drawing from beneath the ledger. She added one line of her own, light and careful, beneath the front windows. A shelf for bread that waits for people who need it. She stared at the words until the lamp began to smoke. Then she folded the paper and held it against her chest for one breath before putting it away. The cold settled harder in the first week of February. It came under doors, through sleeve seams, around window glass, and into the bones of the town before breakfast. Freight wagons were delayed somewhere east of the ridge, and by Tuesday the bins at Briggs' Bakery sat lower than Dolly liked. She ran her hand through the flour and felt the bottom of the barrel too soon. Mr. Briggs cursed the road, the weather, the mill, and every hungry family that still expected bread. Dolly said nothing. She counted what remained. Enough for 2 full batches if she was careful. 3 if she cut the white flour with cornmeal and stretched the rye with potato. Work first, worry after. She baked smaller loaves that morning and marked them at a lower price with a pencil stub on brown paper. Mr. Briggs frowned until the first mother came in with 3 children and counted her coins on the counter with red fingers. Dolly wrapped one small loaf, then added a second heel from the cooling board. The youngest child tucked it inside his coat like treasure. Tobias came in while the boy was still at the door. He took in the low flour bin, the smaller loaves, the paper sign, and Dolly's hands dusted with cornmeal instead of wheat. He bought his rye without comment. Then he went outside and tied 2 sacks of oats from his saddle to Mrs. Wilkes's sled before riding north. By afternoon, men from the James Ranch brought in a wagon covered with canvas. Not flour. Potatoes, dried apples, beans, and 3 hams from Tobias's smokehouse. Practical food. Winter food. Food that did not ask anyone to be grateful before it helped them live. Dolly stood in the alley as the ranch hands unloaded it. One of them, a young man named Eli, kept his hat in his hands when he told her Mr. James said the bakery oven was the warmest place in town and she would know what to do with it. That was not praise exactly. It was trust. She used the potatoes first, boiling them until soft, mashing them into dough to make the flour last. She simmered beans behind the stove for families who could not carry much home. She sliced the ham thin and saved the bone for broth. By sundown, the bakery smelled less like a shop and more like a kitchen that belonged to everyone. Children came in 2 at a time to warm their hands. Old Mr. Keene sat on the bench near the stove with a cup of broth balanced carefully between both palms. Mary Wilkes stayed after her boys had eaten, washing spoons in the back pan without being asked. Dolly did not have a family in that room, not by blood, not by name. Still, when she turned from the oven and saw people making space for one another, passing bread down the counter, setting aside the soft pieces for the little ones, something in the room had shifted. Not toward her all at once. Around her, Tobias returned after dark with snow on his hat and his coat stiff at the shoulders. He stopped just inside the door. Dolly was kneading the last batch, sleeves rolled, hair loosened from its pins, flour across one cheek. Eli was carrying water. Mary was drying cups. 2 children were asleep under a quilt near the stove. Tobias looked at the full room, then at the low fire, and without a word took off his gloves and brought in more wood from the alley. Dolly watched him stack it beside the stove where her hand could reach. He did not stand near her. He did not need to. When the last loaves came out, she wrapped one in the clean cloth and set it on the shelf he had built. Tobias placed no coin on the counter this time. Instead, he took the broom from the corner and swept the flour from the floor while the town ate what her hands had made. By morning, the town had learned where to come when the cold got too mean. Nobody said it that way. They only pushed through the bakery door with empty baskets, stiff fingers, and children tucked close under shawls, and Dolly found places for all of them without stopping the work. She moved the bench nearer the stove for old Mr. Keene. She cut the potato bread thinner so every family could take some home. She sent Eli to fetch more water from the pump before the bucket ran dry. Briggs watched from the doorway of his office, his mouth pulled tight at the corners, counting what charity cost while Dolly counted what hunger needed. Near noon, Cecilia Holt came in with her sister and 2 women from the church committee, all wrapped in wool too fine for the room. Cecilia looked at the children near the stove, the ranch hands carrying wood through the back, the shelf with the marked-down loaves, and then at Dolly's apron, dusted white from waist to hem. She asked whether Briggs' Bakery had become a poorhouse. The room went still in the way a room does when people are too tired for cruelty but know it when they hear it. Dolly lifted a tray of rolls from the oven and set it on the board. She did not answer at once. She brushed her hands on her apron, took the small paper sign that marked the loaves cheaper, and moved it from the side shelf to the front counter. Then she laid 3 warm rolls in a cloth and gave them to the youngest Holt's servant girl, standing half-hidden behind the women, her eyes fixed on the bread and her hands bare in the cold. That was the answer. It filled the room better than words would have. Tobias came in through the back, just then with a load of split wood across both arms. He saw Cecilia. He saw the servant girl holding the rolls. He saw Dolly standing at the counter, small beside the oven heat, and still somehow the center of the room. He stacked the wood, took off his hat, and set 1 more coin beside the jar for widow coal. Then he stepped behind the counter only long enough to lift the heavy flour barrel onto its blocks where Dolly had been, struggling with it all morning. He stepped back again. The line between them held. Respect first. But everyone saw whose side he had chosen. That afternoon, Mr. Briggs told Dolly the extra baking would come from her pay, since she seemed so eager to feed the town. She listened with her hands and dishwater gone gray from flour. When he left, she dried each pan carefully, stacked them, and went upstairs over the harness shop. She took the storefront notice from beneath her wash basin. She took the flour tag with her name on it. She took the brown paper drawing Tobias had made. Then she packed them into her work bag and carried them back through the snow to the bakery. The room was nearly empty by then. The children had gone home. Tobias was outside repairing the loose hinge on the back gate without being asked. Dolly passed him, unlocked the side cabinet, and placed her 3 papers inside beside the starter crock she had kept alive for years. Not upstairs anymore. Not hidden in a lonely room. Here, in the place where people had been fed. Tobias looked up from the hinge and saw the cabinet close. Dolly turned the key once and put it in her apron pocket. She went back to the counter and began measuring flour for morning. For the first time, she was not keeping the dream safe because it might save her someday. She was keeping it there because this town had already started becoming hers. The next morning, Mr. Briggs locked the front door before sunrise. Dolly stood on the boardwalk with her work bag in one hand and the starter crock wrapped in her shawl, watching lamplight move behind the bakery glass while the cold worked through her boots. Inside, Briggs turned the sign closed and looked past her as if 6 years of mornings had never happened. A paper was nailed to the door. Services no longer required. Dolly read it once. Then she looked down at the crock in her arms, warm from the life still working inside it. Tobias arrived before the street had fully woken. He did not go to the door first. He came to Dolly, took off his gloves, and lifted the crock from her arms with the care a man used for something that could not be replaced. Only then did he read the paper. No anger crossed his face. Nothing hurried. He carried the crock across the street to his wagon, set it in a nest of folded blankets, and returned with a canvas roll under one arm. Mr. Briggs opened the door enough to tell him the matter was private. Tobias placed 3 months of bakery accounts on the threshold, each bill tied and marked in Dolly's hand, showing whose bread had kept the shop alive through the freeze. Then he set down receipts for the potatoes, wood, oats, and ham his ranch had supplied without charging Briggs a cent. The town had begun to gather by then, drawn by the locked door, the paper, and the quiet shape of a choice being made in public. Tobias did not raise his voice. He only took the old storefront key from his coat pocket and placed it in Dolly's flour-dusted palm. The owner had signed the lease at dawn. Her name was on it. Dolly stared at the key, then across Main Street at the 2 dusty windows and the cold brick oven waiting in the dark. Mary Wilkes stepped forward first with a basket of clean cloths. Mr. Keene came next with kindling tied in twine. Eli brought 2 sacks of flour from the wagon. One by one, people crossed the street behind Dolly, carrying what they could. Tobias stayed beside the wagon until the starter crock was safe in her hands again. Then he opened the empty storefront door and stepped back, letting her enter first. By noon, the cold brick oven had a fire in it again. Not a proud fire yet, only a steady one, fed with Mr. Keene's kindling and washed by Dolly as if it were a small child learning to stand. Mary Wilkes washed the front windows. Eli carried in flour. The little boys lined clean cloths along the new shelf Tobias had hung beneath the glass, and every few minutes one of them looked at Dolly to make sure he had done it right. She nodded each time. By late afternoon, the first loaves came out uneven, darker on one side where the oven still needed mending, but they were hers. Dolly set the best rye in the front window. Then she wiped her hands on her apron and turned the sign around. Open. The bell rang once. Tobias stepped inside with his hat in his hands and placed a coin on the counter. Exact as always. Dolly wrapped the loaf in the same clean cloth that had passed between them all winter. Before he lifted it, he set a small wooden sign beside the till. Parker Bakery. The letters were plain, careful, and deep enough to last. Dolly touched the edge of her name with one flour-dusted finger. Outside, family slowed at the window. Children pointed. Someone laughed softly, not unkindly. Tobias took the loaf, then placed a second thing on the counter, a narrow gold ring resting in a folded square of brown paper. No speech came with it. Only his hand, open beside hers, steady as the stove heat. Dolly looked at the bread on the shelf, the starter crock by the oven, the people waiting at the door, and the man who had never once asked her to be smaller so he could stand tall. She took his hand. That evening, the bakery stayed lit after dark. Bread cooled in the window. Coffee warmed on the stove. And for the first time in 6 years, Dolly Parker locked the door from the inside of a place that belonged to her.